There's an old well behind my grandfather's barn. It's been boarded up for as long as anyone can remember. No one in the family talks about it, and if you ask, they just give you one rule: never go near it. It wasn't until I got older that I realized how strange that was. We weren't a superstitious family, but when it came to the well, everyone avoided it like the plague. One summer evening, I was outside fixing a broken hinge on the barn door. The fields were quiet, the air heavy with the smell of freshly cut hay. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that made everything look off. That's when I heard it. A voice. Help me. At first I froze. I wasn't even sure I'd heard it. It was faint, almost drowned out by the breeze. But then it came again, clearer this time. Please, help me. It was coming from the well. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but curiosity, or maybe something else, drew me closer. The boards covering the well looked the same as always, weathered, warped, but solid. I told myself it had to be the wind or some kind of animal. But then, the voice came again. Don't leave me down. Here! My throat tightened. Who's there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. Then faintly a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. I should have turned around right then. I knew better. But there's something about hearing a voice like that, begging for a help. You can't ignore it, no matter how wrong it feels. I grabbed a crowbar from the barn and started prying off the boards. The first one came loose with a groan, then the second. By the time I got to the last board, the air had changed. It was heavier, thicker, and then came the smell. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Sour, rotten, like meat left out to decay. I gagged, but I couldn't stop myself. I leaned over the edge and shone my flashlight down. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating stagnant water about 20 feet below. At first, there was nothing. Just the still black surface. Then, something moved, a hand, pale, bloated, and far too long. It slid up the wall of the well, its fingers gripping the stone like claws. Then another hand, and then its face. I don't even know if I can call it a face. It looked human, but wrong. Its skin was swollen and split, with patches of blackened rot. Its mouth was stretched wide in a grotesque grin, and its eyes, they weren't eyes. Just hollow sockets, oozing thick, black liquid. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it spoke. You shouldn't have opened it. Its voice was different now, deeper, guttural, like it was coming from somewhere far below the surface of the earth. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It hit the edge of the well and tumbled into the darkness. The last thing I saw was that thing, pulling itself higher, its grin widening as it climbed. I ran. I don't even remember making it to the house, but when I burst through the door, my grandfather was already up. He was waiting for me, his shotgun in one hand and a hammer in the other. You opened it, didn't you? He said, his voice cold. I stammered something, but he didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed a box of nails and marched out to the well. I followed at a distance, too scared to be alone, but too terrified to get close. That night, he didn't just board it up. He reinforced it with steel and carved strange symbols into the wood. I'd never seen anything like them before. And when I asked, he just said, "It's not for you to know." The next morning, he made me promise I'd never touch the well again. He said it in a way that made it clear he wasn't just asking. We never talked about it after that. But sometimes, late at night, I hear things, scratching at the windows, a faint voice on the wind. Help me, please. It's coming. Growing up, our farm had a massive cornfield stretching out behind the house. It was the kind of place that seemed endless. A maze of tall stalks swaying in the wind, whispering secrets you weren't meant to hear. When we were kids, my brother, Danny, and I used to play hide and seek in there, even though our parents warned us not to. They said the cornfield wasn't safe. I thought they were just trying to scare us. I didn't listen. The last time we played there, Danny didn't come back. It was a late summer evening, the kind where the sky is painted in gold and purple. Danny and I were running through the rows, laughing, the dry leaves brushing against us as we called out to each other. I'd found the perfect hiding spot, crouched low beneath a break in the stalks, and I waited for him to come looking. But then I heard him scream. It wasn't playful. It was sharp, panicked, and cut off too quickly. My heart dropped. I stood up and shouted, "Danny!" No answer. I ran toward the sound, the dry stalks whipping at my arms and face. "Danny!" I yelled again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just the rustling of corn in the breeze. Then I saw something move. At first I thought it was him, a shadow slipping between the rows. But it was too tall, too fast. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't Danny. It wasn't human. I froze, staring as the figure stepped out into the open just a few rows ahead of me. It looked like a scarecrow, but it wasn't stuffed with straw. Its head was a burlap sack, stitched into a grotesque grin. The body was long and thin, the clothes hanging off it like skin on a corpse. And its arms were too long, ending in clawed, skeletal fingers. It dragged something behind it. A shoe. Danny's shoe. Couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground as the thing turned its head toward me. Its grin widened, and I swear I heard it laugh, a hollow, rasping sound that made my chest tighten. Then it took a step forward. That broke me. I turned and ran, crashing through the rows, not caring about the cuts on my arms or the sting of the leaves. The sound of its footsteps followed me, heavy and deliberate, like it wanted me to know it was there. I don't know how I made it out of the cornfield, but when I did, I didn't stop running until I reached the house. I burst inside, screaming for my parents, but when we went back to look for Danny, he was gone. The police said he must have gotten lost, that maybe he'd wandered too far. They searched for weeks, but never found a trace of him. A few years later, the new owners of the farm tore down the cornfield. That's when they found the bones. On our family farm, there's a legend we don't talk about much. Every winter, when the ground freezes solid and the wind bites through the trees, someone sees him, the phantom plowman. The story's always the same. Late at night he appears, in the fields, a man in tattered clothes, pushing an ancient plow through the frozen earth. But the ground is too hard for any plow to cut. And the man, he's not really a man. I never believed it. Not until I saw him myself. It was mid-January, and I'd been out late tending to the animals. The night was brutally cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air like smoke. I'd just finished locking up the chicken coop when I saw something moving in the distance. At first, I thought it was the moonlight playing tricks on me, but as I squinted, the figure came into focus. A man, hunched and slow, pushing an old-fashioned plow through the frozen field. The sight didn't make sense. The plow was enormous, its wooden handles splintered and cracked, and the blade scraped against the frost-bitten ground, leaving no marks behind. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the still night air. The figure didn't stop. It just kept moving forward, step by step, the blade screeching against the earth. I hesitated, every instinct in me screaming to go back to the house, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward him. My boots crunched against the frost as I approached. "Hey, you okay out here?" That's when he stopped. Slowly, the figure straightened up, his head tilting slightly as if he'd just noticed me. My stomach turned as I realized how wrong he looked. His clothes were shredded, hanging in strips off his thin frame. His hands, gripping the plow's handles, were pale and skeletal, the fingers bent at unnatural angles. And then he turned to face me. His face, there wasn't much left of it. The skin was gray and sagging, his hollow eyes sunken deep into his skull. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and frost clung to his hair like cobwebs. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. And then he spoke. "You can't bury it." The voice was low and broken, like wind whistling through dead trees. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The plow started moving again. But this time, no hands were pushing it. The figure stepped away, his head slowly turning toward the horizon. I watched in horror as the plow dragged itself across the frozen ground, carving deep furrows into the earth that weren't there before. When I finally snapped out of it, I bolted for the house. I locked the doors and sat by the window, staring out at the field until dawn. The next morning, I went back to the field. The furrows were still there, long, deep scars in the frozen ground, but there was no sign of the plow or the man. But here's the thing. The furrows, they formed a pattern, a shape, a message: leave. Every town has its ghost stories, and ours was about the old barn on the edge of the county. No one uses it anymore, not since the fire decades ago. They say the farmer and his livestock were trapped inside when it went up in flames. People say, you can still hear them, the screams. I thought it was just a story, a way to keep kids from trespassing. But one night, my friends and I decided to see for ourselves. It was a stupid dare, the kind of thing teenagers do when they want to act brave. The barn was a rotting shell of what it used to be. Its charred beams jutted up into the sky like skeletal fingers, and the whole place leaned precariously, as if it could collapse at any moment. As we stepped inside, the air turned colder, thick with the smell of soot and decay. Creepy, but nothing special, one of my friends muttered, kicking at the dusty floor. Then we heard it. At first it sounded faint, almost like the crackling of embers. But it grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. Screaming. It wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, men, women, animals, all crying out at once. The sound echoed through the barn, rising and falling like a wave, and it sent a chill straight through me. My friend Sarah grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the barn door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. We ran to it, pulling and shoving, but it wouldn't budge. "Let us out!" Sarah screamed. But the only response was the growing cacophony of voices. Then the shadows started moving. At first, I thought it was the flicker of our flashlights. But no, the shadows had shape. A man with half his face burned away. A cow standing on broken legs, its eyes hollow and glowing. A horse dragging its charred body across the floor. The figures moved closer, their screams now mixing with words we could barely understand. "Why didn't you save us?" one of them whispered, the words crackling like fire. "You let us burn." My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching as one of the shadows, its features distorted and blistered, reached out for me. Its hand passed through my arm and I felt it. Burning heat, like my skin was about to blister. Something yanked me back, It was Sarah, dragging me toward a side door we hadn't noticed before. It creaked open just enough for us to squeeze through, and we tumbled out into the night, gasping for air. When we looked back, the barn was dark and silent. The screams were gone, as if they'd never been there. A week later, the barn burned down again. This time there was no one inside. No one alive, anyway. My grandparents' farmhouse had a root cellar, a dark, dirt-floored room beneath the house where they stored potatoes, carrots, and jars of preserves. I hated it. The air down there was always damp and heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift when no one was looking. But what I hated most was the way it felt, like something was watching. One fall afternoon, my grandfather asked me to grab some potatoes from the cellar. I froze, hoping he'd ask someone else, but his tone made it clear it wasn't a request. So I grabbed a lantern and made my way down the creaky wooden stairs. The smell hit me first, wet earth and something faintly sour. The single bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the dirt walls. The crates of potatoes were lined up neatly in the corner, but the far side of the cellar was pitch black, as if the light refused to reach it. As I grabbed a potato, I heard it. A faint, scratching sound. I froze, holding my breath. It was soft at first, like nails dragging lightly over wood. But then it grew louder, more insistent, coming from the far corner where the darkness lingered. "Grandpa?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, shuffling noise, like something dragging itself across the dirt. My heart pounded as I slowly turned, lifting the lantern to see what was there. At first, there was nothing, just the dark, uneven wall of the cellar. But then the dirt began to move. A hand broke through the surface. It was pale, skeletal, with long, thin fingers that clawed at the ground as if trying to pull itself free. I stumbled back, my lantern shaking as the rest of it emerged. The thing was hunched and bony, its skin stretched tight over its frame like dried leather. Its face was a nightmare, hollow eyes that glowed faintly, a wide mouth filled with jagged teeth, and skin so thin you could see the veins beneath. It tilted its head at me, its mouth curling into a grin. "Hungry," it rasped, its voice like wind through dead leaves. I dropped the lantern and bolted up the stairs, the sound of its dragging body following close behind. I slammed the cellar door shut and threw the lock, pressing my back against it as my chest heaved. When my grandfather found me, he didn't ask what happened. He just sighed and grabbed a hammer and nails. That night, he nailed the cellar door shut and poured a thick layer of concrete over it. "It's better this way," he muttered, his face pale. I never asked him what he knew, but sometimes when the house is quiet, I hear it. A faint scratching sound, coming from beneath the floorboards. The stories might have ended, but the feeling of something watching you lingers, doesn't it? Maybe it's just your imagination, or maybe these tales hold truths that were never meant to be shared. Remember, some things, once awakened, don't go back to sleep so easily. If you enjoyed these stories and want more chilling tales of the unexplained, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. And in the meantime, keep an eye on the shadows around you. After all, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you.